So I went into 2011 actually with some degree of optimism, further fed by the fact that in December of 2010, actually before the new members were sworn in, when I was still the leader of a rather diminished minority of 41, and Boehner had an even more sort of hopeless minority in the House, I was involved in negotiating with the Vice President an extension of the current tax rates, the so-called Bush tax cuts. By the way, they were tax cuts 10 years ago. They're not tax cuts any longer, but they're referred to as the Bush tax cuts. A 2-year extension of the Bush tax cuts, and a new estate tax law that if you run a small business or a family farm in Kentucky, I bet you've taken a look at, because it's got a very good 35% rate, but even more importantly, if you're still alive, a 5 million exemption that, by the way, you don't have to die to use. You can use it now. You can't use it twice, but you can use it now. And there are farms all across Kentucky that are getting those family farms down to the next generation by taking advantage of that exemption. Same thing with family-owned small businesses. It's always a big problem. How do you get it down to the next generation? How do you come up with the cash to pay the estate tax? A pretty good deal, I thought. And most people felt that my side had gotten more out of this deal than the other side. And I thought, well, maybe this is an indication that we can do some business. Well, regretfully, looking back over 11, it proved to be an aberration and not the beginning of a trend. And so we did not have the coming together that I had hoped we would have over the two biggest issues threatening our future, which are deficit, annual deficit, and debt. When the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, our top military guy, when asked the question, what is our biggest national security threat, says the debt, that's all you need to know. And if you're looking for the direction in which we're headed, look across the Atlantic to Europe. The first thing I would say in looking at Europe, Margaret Thatcher said many things. By the way, there's going to be a new Margaret Thatcher movie, and I know in Meryl Streep's politics, I hope she's not too bad, not too tough on Margaret Thatcher. But Margaret Thatcher famously said, the problem with socialism is pretty soon you run out of other people's money. And in Europe right now, they're running out of other people's money. What they have done is constructed such a massive welfare state that they can't afford it. Some of you may have noticed a few years ago in the presidential election in France, and France and Germany, by the way, are in generally better shape than a lot of the rest of Europe. The last presidential election in France was fought out over the issue of work. They had a national debate about whether work was a good thing. Now, it strikes me, if you're having a debate about the value of work, you've got a problem. Now, the candidate in favor of work won, narrowly, but you get the drift. A guy I know who used to run a European company said that the Europeans say the difference between Europeans and Americans is that Americans live to work and Europeans work to live. That pretty well sums it up. Leisure and benefits are so highly valued that they have constructed states that they can't afford. It's most acute in Southern Europe, and you've seen it in Greece and in Spain and in Italy, but it's not non-existent in France and Germany. And of course they've collectivized all this through the European Union, and now the German and French taxpayers are being asked, in effect, how do you feel about using your tax money to bail out other countries? So they've exacerbated the problem by collectivizing, and I don't really know how they get out of this, but the reason I bring it up is that's what we don't want to be. And we now have a debt the size of our economy. And that alone makes you look like Greece. And I assure you, ladies and gentlemen, this problem we dealt with, you can either deal with it in advance or you'll deal with it. If you keep kicking the can down the road, one day you're grease. So the time to do it is now, and my great disappointment in looking back at 2011 was that in spite of all the internal struggles we had with each other to try to reach agreement on spending and debt, we were unable to get there. First part of the year, Boehner and myself dealing directly with the President and the Vice President. Later, through a joint committee, we tried again. We struggled all year to try to bring the two sides together to do something significant about changing the direction that we're headed. I'll give you one other statistic, or two actually. We have in the last 3 years increased spending as a percentage of our gross domestic product from about 21% of GDP, which it has roughly stayed at for several decades, to almost 25% of GDP. Revenue for the last few decades was around 20% of GDP, so we had a deficit, but not a huge deficit, a manageable deficit. Revenue is down because of the economy, so the gap, revenue is down, but not because of the rates, because of the economy. What we fear the other side wants to do is to drive the revenue up to keep us in perpetuity with a government at a quarter of our gross domestic product. And if you do that, ladies and gentlemen, then you are Europe. You are Western Europe. And so I see these surveys indicating Congress has a 9% approval rating. By the way, I haven't met any of those 9%. And I would not put myself among the 9%. We need to tackle this problem now, but it does require presidential engagement. Reagan was involved in the Social Security fix. Reagan was involved in tax reform. Clinton was involved in welfare reform, and Clinton was certainly involved in the very difficult challenges in the late 90s of trying to achieve a balanced budget, which, believe it or not, we did for several years in a row. I like the president personally. He's a smart guy. He's a capable guy. But he has a different worldview of what America ought to be. He has a very Western European view of America. And the reason you have probably joined almost everybody in being exasperated with inaction in Washington this year is that we have not been able to pull the two sides together to tackle the biggest problem. Looking at it another way, only 40% of what we spend a year, which is way too much, we spend way too much. We've had over $1 trillion deficit for each of the last 3 years. Only 40% of it do we actually vote on. That's called the discretionary budget. The balance of it is either interest on the national debt or entitlements. And the reason we use the word entitlement is that you get it if you're eligible. And they're very popular. Programs that we all support. Social Security, Medicare, entitlements. You're eligible, you get it. The problem is we are victims of our own success. We are living longer and longer and longer and better and better and better. When Social Security was passed in the 30s, the average lifespan of an American was about 61. You could argue it's a pretty good deal for the government. But now, as a result of the incredible health care that we have in this country, which I hope we haven't permanently fouled up in Obamacare, we are living longer and better, and that is certainly good news. But we can't afford in perpetuity the level of care that we have been offering at taxpayers' expense because of the changing demographics of our country. More and more people living longer and longer, fewer people paying in. The World War II generation, the greatest generation, came home and had one heck of a lot of kids. and they're all retiring now. So you have a massive number of baby boomers and a much smaller number of people paying in. So there's a serious issue of generational equity here. Do we really want to do this to our kids and to our grandkids? Now, the good news is, if you're already retirement age, you can tune out this whole discussion. Just tune it out. It's not going to affect you. But you need to change it down the road to reflect the demographics of the country at that time. And as I said, you either deal with it now in advance. The wonderful thing about what Reagan and Tip O'Neill did on Social Security, people had plenty of time to plan. You could look at the chart and figure out what the retirement age was going to be for Social Security by the time you got there, well in advance. Not exactly a Greek way to do it. Tanking and then hoping somebody's going to bail you out. And so this would have been the perfect time to do it with divided government. And the reason I say perfect time, I'm sure there's nobody in the room who gives a hoot about whether somebody commits political suicide. You don't care at all. But if I'm the Republican leader of the Senate, or I'm Harry Reid and I'm the Democratic leader of the Senate, and I'm trying to round up the votes for something, it's not a particularly inspiring message, David, for me to go to my members and say, I got a good deal for you. You can vote for this and you're finished. So the beauty of doing it together, I ran for the Senate the first time in 1984. I was never asked a single solitary question, not one, about what had happened the year before I got there when Reagan and Tip O'Neill raised the age of Social Security. It was a non-issue. Why? They did it together. And they took it off the political playing field. Neither side could take advantage of it. And had we been able to do what we needed to do in 11, and candidly, I had this conversation with the president. I said, if we can come together, nobody's going to pay a price for this. American people won't like it. They don't ever want us to mess with Medicare and Social Security. I understand that. These are the most popular programs the federal government has. We all understand that. But to make necessary changes, you have to do it together. So it was a missed opportunity. Let me say this. This issue isn't going away. So if you miss the opportunity in 11, you'll be back in 12 and back in 13. It's not going away. And what I'm hoping is that at some point in the near term, soon, not years from now, we will come together across party lines and do what needs to be done to put this country on a path to fiscal solvency for the long term. I'll end, before taking your questions, on an upbeat note. We've always had big challenges in this country. I mean, what could have been a bigger challenge than the Civil War, or the wars that we've been involved in, or the depressions that we've had over the history of this country that have come and gone from time to time? We have a great resiliency. We've survived every one of them. I'm convinced we can do this. But I would remind you that when you see us arguing about this is not over small stuff. This is a big debate about very big things. And I know as a result of 24-hour TV and the internet, you're getting it in your face every day. And you're probably sick and tired of hearing all this stuff, and you're hearing about us arguing about it and wondering why in the world can't you get along. Well, we get along just fine. This is not personal. I'm a great admirer of the president. This has nothing to do with how we feel about each other personally. This is a very significant argument about what kind of country do you want to have. And it is not easy to bridge the differences. But we must do that. I don't know whether the election outcome this year will make this easier or harder. But the truth is, it's going to have to be dealt with. No matter who wins this year, you can't repeal the math. You can't hope the trajectory is something other than it is. And so we will get this done. And from my point of view, I want to do it sooner rather than later. And I hope that we elect the kind of people who allow that to happen.